do they look like? That's the title of my talk. Subtitle, Writing for Audio-Only Games. You guessed it, characters that talk a lot but don't have any images in the game. That question came up a lot. I'll be talking to you about the writing process for a game like that. I'll also be talking about how to show your progress to external partners when all you have is like a branching tool where all your words in and no way of really showing that to people who don't use that tool. And I'll also go in a bit about casting and working with the voice actors. I'll be doing that using the example of the game Old Frequencies. More about that later on. Just a little bit so you know who I am. I have a background in writing for film and theater. I did a lot of directing in theater, a lot of interactive theater, immersive theater, and from there made my way into the games, basically because I found that there was a lot of correlation between the two, and I'd always been an avid gamer, and so I tried to see if that was a course of work for me, and I've been, well, mainly working in games for the last couple of years, writing and doing narrative design for mainly mobile games. Next to that, I'm the curator for the Imagine Film Festival in Amsterdam, which is where I'm from, where I curate VR and games section. I'm an improv player, have been for 15 years, and I'm currently co-hosting a Nirvana podcast. Just some random trivia. So that's me. Some other facts. We're going to be talking about Old Frequencies. Old Frequencies is a game that was released on mobile and PC a couple of months ago, made by French studio Accidental Queens. This game, oh, we're playing already. We'll show you this and let you hear what's happening in a bit. This game is what we call audio only. Well, not only because we have visuals, but we'll get into that later. The game is about a country not unlike countries that we all live in, where there are environmental problems, and the environmental problems have caused the government to propose a time loop. The time loop will help the environment to heal. How that works, you'll see in the game. But there needs to be a vote on that, a referendum. And yeah, exactly. We made this last year, and we had some inspiration. But what people don't know, and what you will find out as a player in this game, is that that time loop is already in place, which means that we have looping series of information, 3-minute loops. And as a player, you will switch between radio stations. Those radio stations all have a broadcast, and the puzzles that you will need to do is to distribute information to make sure that you can unlock the truth of what's happening, or maybe you're unlocking the wrong truth. That could happen as well. The way it works is you download snippets of information. Basically, you hear something, you think, okay, this is part of a puzzle. So you download it by swiping down. And then you go to another station, which you think, like, they might want to hear this. And you flick up, and you send that snippet of information to them. You always get a reaction. Even if it's not correct, you still will get a reaction. And if you do the right things and you solve the puzzles, you will progress through the gameplay and through the story. Just to illustrate this, can we play the video just to see and hear a bit of the gameplay?
Are the facts. Kamal Macmillan, politician, pro-time loop activist and violator of human rights, actually leads the group that activated the time loop. Amal Macmillan is the person who ordered to activate the time loop.
With loads.
We'll be talking about the vote all week, so if you have thoughts or opinions on the time loop, let us know.
We need to find out how this time loop will impact our lives.
Amal Macmillan, politician, pro-time loop activist, and violator of human rights, actually leads the group that activated the time loop.
Wait, what? Are you hearing this, Jenny?
Alt frequencies.
Okay, so that sort of illustrates what you do in the game. Yeah, starting points. There were a couple of things we knew that we wanted to do when we started this game. A lot of characters. We had 5 different radio stations. So you have hosts, you have people who call in. Eventually, it turned out to be over 20 characters. And without visualization, so all that you just saw in that in a video, that's basically all you see. So no images of the people who are talking. We have audio in 3 languages. So the recording audio is in English, in French, and in German. There's also a version in Italian and in Spanish, but they're just the words. So you play, for instance, the English one, and you see it in Spanish in the image. Yeah, radio stations. So that meant specific language, tone of voice. It would have the feeling that you get when you would normally listen to a radio station or like switch through different stations. So it needs to be recognizable for people. Diversity in characters and cast, that was something that was very important. And accessibility. And the accessibility, the basic idea was that this game would have to be playable by people who are visually impaired. And not only playable, they would need to have the exact same experience as people who would be able to see would have. So any visual image that you see, if you are able to see, when you play this game, should only be, well, the text and maybe something extra just to make it nice, but shouldn't be an advantage to you compared to people who wouldn't be able to see that. The accessibility went the other way around as well, I have to add, because as you can see, we had the text in the images, but we also added a closed caption version, so you would also be able to play the game if you couldn't hear it. That wasn't the prerequisite from the start, but it made sense to make it fully accessible as much as we could. Okay, so what did we do when we started out writing? Well, these were the things that were most important to me, and I found out while writing on this. The first thing, focus on what they sound like, not what they look like. And by they, I mean the characters, obviously. This may sound logical, but I can imagine that many of you who write will, when they start writing a character, see somebody in their head, even if there's no artwork or whatever yet. You will envision somebody. I actively tried not to do that because I really wanted to mimic, as a writer, what our players would be experiencing. Because it's just like reading a book. When you read a book the first time, unless there's like a movie of it or it has characters on the front of the book, you read the words, and then slowly while reading it, you will start to get an idea of how somebody would look. And that was what would happen with this game as well. People play it, at first they hear the character, and only then they start to imagine what they look like. So I tried to really put myself into the shoes of the player and really block out any mental image that I had. But that meant that I had to think a bit more about what they would sound like. Distinctive voices, obviously. So people with really different sounds. We'd have more than 20 characters, so it's also pretty important that when you start playing, you know the difference between the characters. It's going to be a lot of people that are being introduced to you in a short period of time. So the more distinctive the voices would be, the better. And the earlier I started thinking about that, the better as well. And distinctive voices is obviously also different accents, different speech patterns, different use of words. Basically all the things you would also do if you write a character that is not audio only, but in this case, I think it was more important even. Make the first introduction stand out. As I said, there's over 20 characters, so that means that you want the player to get to know them as fast as you can. So making sure that the first time they get to know a character, there's something in there, apart from their voices, that is distinctive and that really defines them, will help the player understand a bit more. I was just, for people who were here for the talk that Ed Veer did, he was talking about how you can use stereotypes as long as you build on them later on. That was something that really rang true for this game as well. It's okay to start out with slightly stereotypical characters just because it's recognizable and it's easier for people, but try to build on it later on, which we did for this one. The next one, use names often or not at all. With so many characters, you want to learn their names because that helps, and also you needed it for the puzzles. So use their names often. Have people call others by their names so the player gets to know them. But if they're talking about people who aren't relevant or talk about people who aren't actually in the game, try to minimize names, because a name makes a character be important, and also people will be triggered by that. So if you say like, oh, Fred said to me that and that, and Fred is not in the game, people will remember the name and think, oh, we'll see him later, or hear him later in this case. So make sure you guide your players into which characters are important to remember and which characters are not important to remember. And so using names or not using names at all, just referring to somebody as like the minister or whatever, or a policeman, helps them in this. Focus on the spoken word, not the written word. This is also something that has been talked about in various talks today and probably tomorrow as well. There's a big difference between the spoken and the written word. We were making an audio-only game, so focusing on how people speak is important, especially since this was radio. So making it like normal radio talk with a lot of uhs and ahs and maybe sentences that don't really finish or trail off and go to something else. That was all possible. The only caveat here was that, like I already mentioned, you see the words on the screen when you play, if you can see them. And we also added closed captions, so it's possible to play this game just looking at the words and not listening to it. And actually that can be, well, that can have different reactions, because sometimes spoken words, when written on the page, are sound less relevant, less of a nice way of writing stuff. So that was a bit of a difficult thing, I guess. That means that for me, at least, sometimes if I look at the words and I know that some people might play it without listening to it, I have some lines in there that I feel are sort of cringe-worthy at that moment. But on the other hand, well, it's a small price to pay, I think, for making this game accessible to basically everyone who wants to play it. So just a matter of thinking about what's important to you. Last thing, don't mention visual things too much. Annoying for the player, I mentioned. It's an easy example, I think, is like if somebody is in a radio station studio and says like, oh, I see they have like a new plant there in the corner. That looks nice. Or you could say like, oh, I think I left my my notes somewhere. Can you check my bag and see if they're in there? Because that you can hear. We had a great audio designer who did all of these things. So somebody rummaging through their bag, you can do that in audio, and then it's not bad to mention that. But if you mention things that you cannot put into audio, it can be really annoying for the player. So don't mention visual things too much. Okay, so that were the basics for the writing part. But then we had a next step, because the team in the studio, we all knew what we were working on, we all knew what we were doing, we understood everything, but we had external partners as well. Arte, for instance, who funded this game, wanted updates on what we're doing. We were going to playtest later on. We were going to cast actors, talk to casting directors, stuff like that. And all of this was going on while we were still in the midst of developing and writing. So I think that most people will know things like that and working that. We worked in an awesome tool that was specially designed for this game. Clémence is the name of this system, made by Diane, one of the founders of Accidental Queens. It was an awesome system to work with. Basically, it works with branching storylines like most of you know how to work with. But this one was especially for audio and was especially useful for us because we don't only have branching storylines in this one, but we also have what we called interruptions. Because like I mentioned before, you can basically, as a player, do everything. You can basically download every little snippet of sound in the game and send it to basically everybody else at whatever moment in the game you want. So that basically means that there's multiple options for reactions. And there's the reactions that you need for progressing in the game. But there's also the reactions to random things. Like, for instance, there's in one of the chapters, there's somebody took a dog to the studio. And you can actually download the dog barking and then send it to all of the other stations and just see what happens when they react to it. And they all react. So you have like 4 or 5 different reactions from 4 or 5 different stations. And then sometimes there's even 2 different reactions on a station when there's, for instance, you send it at the beginning of the time loop or at the end of the time loop. So that's a lot of extra branching going on there, which all work perfectly in the system. But that's because we all worked in this and we got it. But how do you present something like this to external partners? Well, like I mentioned there, branching and no visuals equals confusion. It's easier, I think, to present stuff like this if you have things like this to add, because that at least makes it a bit more clear about what you're doing. We had images as well. We had this. So basically, that on that side is how it looks in the game. And this is sort of a way to try and extract it and make people read it. Well, like I said, I think there's many of you here today who are used to working with systems like this and probably have the same kind of problems. I'm going to be honest and tell you that I don't know how to solve this, and I don't think you really can solve it. But I do think that at least being aware of the fact that you might need to present it to others and how they would see this will help you to make it slightly easier. So yeah, think about the best way to export and present your script. Think about directional notes and audio design related notes. This is one of the things that is, I found the biggest issue that we had. I was used to writing directional notes in the dialogue. I always do that. I was trained for writing for theater, and basically that's what you do. And then you also know that once a director starts rehearsing your script, he will cross everything out, which is fine because those directional notes are in there for the reader. And that was something that I knew, but I sort of had to forget for this because since we were writing directly into the tool, that meant that any directional note that you put in there, even if it's like between brackets, like he's laughing or whatever, you need to take it out later on because what's in the tool was on the screen to the right, and taking everything out of the whole system with the amount of words that we had would have been horror. And also we had like a maximum amount of words that we could fit in there. So leaving directional notes in there would mean that we wouldn't know if it was too long or too short or whatever. But that also meant that if you send this to a partner who is not really part of your process but still wants to know what you're doing, they will not get that context. So if you're not able to put directional notes directly into there, maybe think of a way to at least add notes, or for instance, if you extract it like this, maybe add something in there, especially for the people who need to read this, to make it easier for them to understand what you're doing. And perhaps add some extra visual aids, but be aware people will then cling on to the visuals that are there. If there's not much to see, then we live in a visual media world, so they will definitely cling on to every little visual thing, even if it's mock-up, temporary, or something that you just use to explain something. So be aware that that could happen. Same goes for user testing. We had a great UX designer who did a lot of work on this, and that was really relevant. But we had obviously the problem that we couldn't audio record everything with the right actors for testing, because this is an indie project, so there's not enough money to start a recording and do it over and over again. We could do in-game testing without audio, just going through it, which is great to see your own work in a different light. But since the audio part was the most important part, we also wanted to do the in-game testing with audio. We did a couple of different versions using like temp voices, stuff like that. And that worked, but just to be sure, if you want to do something like that, tread carefully. People will like or dislike voices. They will really like or dislike voices. And that will influence their opinion about the character, that will influence their opinion about the story. And that means that you might have false testing results, because once you do it with the real actor or the official actor or the professional actor, they might have a whole different opinion. So, and same goes for, yeah, good acting influences opinion, so make sure you know that when you do user testing with temp things, because, well, it's always, using temp things is always difficult in user testing, but for voices, it's such an incredible influence that it needs a bit of extra attention. Okay, then we go to the casting. The general parameters that we had were the distinctive voices, the diverse casting. That was something that was really important for us. Gender, age, cultural background, professional background. We really wanted a lot of different people. And that proved not to be very easy. Not everybody understood that we wanted that and why we wanted that. Bear in mind, we worked with recording studio and 3 different languages, so 3 different casting directors, different places to record, different cultural backgrounds. That meant that it wasn't always easy to explain why we wanted something specific. But what we maintained throughout, and which we found important and which we needed to stress, was the authenticity. What you hear is what we saw, meaning, for instance, we have a child in the game, and it proved a bit difficult to find a child due to like employment, stuff like that, payment. And then we were offered like, okay, we have like this woman who also does children's voices for like cartoons and stuff like that, so we can have her in. And we were like, no, we don't want that. This is, it's radio, it needs to be authentic, and apart from how it's authentic for the player, it's also for us important to do that. So that's something that we maintained. And the other thing is, if you don't hear it and don't see it, does diversity matter? I've put it here as a question because that was a question that we got. Meaning that we wanted actors that you couldn't see their ethnicity, you couldn't hear that in their voices. And so one of the casting directors actually asked, okay, so if you don't see them, and if you can't hear on their voices what they look like, does diversity matter to you? And obviously, I don't have to, yes, it does. So that was something that we had to fight for, but we thought it was worth it. Okay, so recording, just to go over this really fast. Trust the actor. I think that's self-explanatory. Because we had no animation, we had room for improv and changes, which was great, but game time constraints, puzzles, put a cap on that. Also, you have to go back and change every word that they change, and it's a script, not subtitles. When you do subtitles, you don't have to do it verbatim. People don't expect that. But for us, we had to do that. There's even, after release, we had like 1 or 2 small things that were changed in the words that we didn't change in the text, and people immediately started like, oh no, it's not exactly the same. So be aware if you're doing something like that, you need to do it exactly like the actors said it. Okay, so to round up, my personal learnings start with the distinctive, recognizable voices, characters, and situations. It's obvious, but during the work on this game, it was clear to me that for audio only, it was even more important. So this is really number 1. Second one, others can't hear what you hear in your head, so give examples if needed. In the studio, sometimes I used audio examples of persons or actors, which I thought like, this is a bit the way that this character would sound like in my head. That really helps. And like I said before, check how things are exported and presented. Audio design rules. Please go and talk to an audio designer, even if you're not working on an audio game or not even on voice games, not yet. If you are interested in doing that, have a chat, and you're a writer or a narrative designer, have a chat with an audio designer, because they have amazing ideas that can really influence you. So go and find someone and ask them to have a coffee and just pick their brains, because they're really great. And then hire them for your games as well. And finally, audio-based games are a hard sell. I've put outside of smart speakers because that's a whole different ball game that you're hearing from in a couple of minutes. But the whole problem of just doing audio is that everything that we found during working on this, you also find when you have to sell the game. Because if those images are the only ones you have, yeah, how beautiful they are, but it's still words and a radio. And it's incredibly hard to sell a game like this first to the people who need to work on it, to people who need to pay for it, and then the people who need to buy it, because you don't have all of the stuff that you want your storefront to be filled with. So be aware, it's a hard sell, but it's totally worth it. Making a game like this or a derivative of a game like this is exciting to work on. It's taught me a lot about writing in general. I'm taking a lot of it with me for other video games, so hopefully I've been able to give something of that to you as well. Thank you. If you want to play the game or see what Accidental Queens have made, that's our awesome team right there. Go to their website. Feel free to ask me questions now or later on. And thank you for listening to me.